Welcome and thank you for joining the National Association of Scholars for this important and interesting event. I'm Peter Wood, the president of the National Association of Scholars and an anthropologist by training, though not in recent practice. Our topic today is the repatriation debate. And in case you're in the wrong place, we're not talking about the repatriation of contemporary immigrants anyplace in the world. We're talking about a law that was passed in the United States in 1990 that gives a certain amount of power to indigenous American groups to reclaim the bones and in some cases artifacts of their ancestors from scientific investigation, usually by archaeologists. I'll be moderating today's event. In a moment, you're going to hear from our two panelists, but I want to give you a little bit more idea of who our speakers are. Bruce Bork is an archaeologist who had served as the archaeologist for the Maine State Museum for about 40 years, also was a lecturer at Bates College during most of that time. He has been widely published, an interesting background in that after his Harvard PhD, he went on to do work in areas like Wabanaki textiles. He's written general histories of the Native American population of Maine, where he does most of his work in maritime Maine, and has been working on the complexity of Paleo-Indian societies in the maritime area, the Gulf of Mexico. He currently lives in Freeport, Maine, and is working on a data-rich archive that will allow some interesting ways for archaeologists to deal with individual sites. Maybe he can tell us a little bit more about that shortly. He's going to be joined by Elizabeth Weiss, who I got to know after the University of Florida Press published one of her books titled Repatriation and the Erasing the Past. Once the book was published, various Native American activists and woke archaeologists decided that this book just wouldn't do, and they put pressure on the University of Florida Press to withdraw the book. Too late for that, but they did succeed in spooking the editors there into basically submarining the efforts to publicize the book or to bring it out in an edition that would make it available to a wider audience. Repatriation and erasing the past was not a brand new topic for Elizabeth. She'd been working in this area for some time, had written previously on it a book titled Reburying the Past, the Effects of Repatriation and Reburial on Scientific Inquiry. That was back in 2008. She'd also spoken at public events in some degree of criticism of what people in the field called NAGPRA, the Native Graves Reappropriation Act. Elizabeth will straighten that out for us. Her public speaking on this began to attract the attention, unwelcome attention in some ways, of colleagues in the field who began to get in the way of her proceeding with her own archaeology. Among the projects that she has been working on in the field has been the study of the largest hunter-gatherer burial site west of the Mississippi. It happens to be in Alameda County, and it spans a 2,500-year range. She had done the most significant work on this site and now is barred from having anything to do with it, not because of any sort of questions about her scientific ability, but simply because of the opposition to her politics, and that is her politics in this sense. I have no idea what her politics in the national sense are, but politics within the field of archaeology have to do with how much of a science is it really? Does it depend on getting the permission of contemporary people to do work on ancient people, or is this something that can be pursued in its own right as an attempt to gain deep knowledge of our past? That said, I think I would like to invite Bruce first to tell us something more about what this whole debate is.
Well, in my case, it focuses, for the sake of simplicity, let's take a case that brought me to this region in the first place. In the 1880s, there was a discovery in Ellsworth, Maine, of a highly unusual burial site. And the artifacts that came out of there were unlike anyone had seen before. And then more and more, and I think we now have 56 or 57 of these cemeteries scattered between Brunswick, Maine, and the St. John River in New Brunswick. And these are highly unusual sites, and they've just pretty much flummoxed archaeology into the 20th century. And I thought, this is too juicy to ignore. And then in 1970, I think, in Newfoundland, a very similar discovery took place. And the person who made that discovery, James Tuck from Memorial University, was someone that had been trained by the same person who trained me. So we were professionally close. But we had these two fairly similar cultures that were off the charts in terms of their complexity and their technological sophistication, their ability to reach out to exchange with people thousands of miles away. They just broke the mold for hunter-gatherer society. So there were two options to consider about how they might relate to each other. And one was they were a parallel kind of development because both of them lived next to very rich marine resources. The other possible explanation was that one derived from the other. Jim favored the latter explanation. I favored the former. And for at least 30 years, we were at loggerheads, friendly loggerheads, but we were loggerheads. We had no way really to test which of these hypotheses might be more accurate. And then came paleogenetics. And fortunately, there's a few sites in Maine that have excellent skeletal preservation. Most of these sites were boneless because our acid soil simply dissolved the bone in a century or two. And Port au Choix was the major site that Jim excavated was at Port au Choix, Newfoundland, on the northern peninsula. And there happened to be, it's a beach, but there happened to be a lot of finely ground shell in the sand. So the bones were beautifully preserved. So that meant that we, as of 2000, early 2000s, when paleogenetics became feasible for archaeological bone, I was thrilled when a laboratory in Massachusetts actually found these bones interesting enough to do an analysis. So the genetic analysis was successful. And in Jim's case, some Canadian paleogeneticists took bones from the Port au Choix site and were successful in their analysis. In the Canadian case, the male population was published by the lab that did the analysis before the woke wave broke over them. In my case, the woke wave broke just in time to discourage the publication of already existing research. And so the ability to resolve the relationship between these two utterly fascinating cultures just slipped beyond my reach.
And why is that a bad thing?
Well, it's a bad thing because it's hard, as I said in my Coolette article, it's hard for people to understand how unusual these cultures are. They are remarkably sophisticated. Their technologies were amazing, unlike anything in the world, actually. Several of their artifacts, private collections will pay thousands upon thousands of dollars for some of these artifacts. You know, you'd think you'd be talking about something dynastic Egypt or something. But at any rate, it's a fascinating archaeological question, fascinating scientific question. Why were they so complex? Could this have happened twice in the Northeast, independently of each other? And to have the data to answer that question arbitrarily snatched by faddish politics is absurd, unjustifiable, unconscionable.
Okay, for those who aren't particularly tuned into Northeast archaeology, the red paint people, as they're often called, from Maine, were, among other things, swordfish hunters. And as far as we know, I think the only swordfish hunters to have existed anywhere until the 19th century, probably. Catching swordfish isn't easy. There is a sophisticated technology. These people were out on the ocean catching large mammals and catching other large fish, bringing them into shore. The technology to do that from, what are we talking about, 3,000 years ago?
4 to 5, 5 to 4.
5 to 4,000 years ago. It is astonishing that this happened in North America. We tend not to think of the Native American past as having that degree of sophistication, certainly not that long ago. And as far as hunter-gatherers go, the standard for sophistication has always been British Columbia, the hunter-gatherers there living in a very rich marine environment. But this technology in the Northeast appears to have exceeded even what the Kwakiutl and the famous tribes of British Columbia and Vancouver were capable of. So there's a mystery there that we would nicely like to have solved, and it appears to have, at least technologically, spread over quite a wide area. These were coastal tribes that had connections to people as far away as the Great Lakes, if I understand this correctly. So they had very wide network, and then they were gone.
Right, disappeared.
Right. Just
I have no explanation.
Right. So an interesting question here is, do the native peoples of Maine in the historical record, the people encountered by the colonists and who have descendants today, like the Penobscot Indians, have any claim to be descendants of these people? Now that's a question that could be answered in a variety of ways. One of them is just by looking at the technology and saying there's no continuity here. Another is to look at the bones and see, do they morphologically look like the same people? And yet there's this question of genetics too, which I think we should spend a little bit more time on, that could answer the question if we dared to let it. And where we are right now is that we dare not answer these questions. Why do we not dare answer these questions, Bruce?
We dare, but there's a mob out there, post-modern woke mob, who have a complex series of motivations. They're not uniform. There are different motivations that range from mendacity to stupidity. And all these people have different motivations, kind of complex to parse it out. But no, we can do it. I think the problem is that this social contagion has affected administrations of institutions of higher learning. And I think I understand how that happened, because I know the backgrounds for these people, often graduate departments of education, where this philosophy actually was probably spawned and is very popular. So we can easily do it. It's not illegal, but as in Elizabeth's case, it's the perfect example. I looked into the person who's denying her access, fairly unimpressive person, I think. And so that's the problem. The crucial access is being denied by some fairly mediocre administrative types.
Elizabeth, I'd like to turn to you, and maybe to get started, you could just give us the historical background. What happened? Archaeology was going along pretty strongly into the 1980s, and then what?
Well, what happened was fairly late into the 80s, we start getting repatriation laws. We have an early one that affected the Smithsonian, that was it was just targeting the Smithsonian's collections of indigenous people. And out of that, we did get the American Indian Museum in DC as well. But in 1990, the Native Americans Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, was passed. And NAGPRA was kind of a compromise for anthropologists and archaeologists. Basically, there was kind of a settlement of, yes, maybe we should return some remains and artifacts to related groups. Maybe it's time to make a compromise, with the knowledge that there would be some loss. However, what happened instead of a compromise is that things went all towards the repatriation side and very little towards the science side. So as NAGPRA has written, you can use science to determine whether people are related to each other, and therefore the skeletal remains or artifacts should be repatriated. But you can also use not science. So you can use oral traditions and oral myths to make the same claims. And throughout the years, from 1990 to now, the importance of which evidence is used has deteriorated, and science is no longer needed to make the claim of affiliation. I think why this is in part because affiliation is hard to determine, and tribes have changed, and some of the oldest tribes are only a couple hundred years old, if that. So I think one of the problems is that there was an unrealistic expectation of how close the skeletal remains and artifacts were to those who were making claims. And therefore what you get is, well, if everything is listed as unaffiliated, then we have to change how we determine who gets what. And the determination was basically that it shouldn't be science. And that's how we started losing the Paleo-Indians, such as Kennewick Man, and why we're in such a state as we are. California, the California law, CalNAGPRA, actually is even more anti-science, I would say, than NAGPRA, in that it says that oral myths are to be given deference to scientific evidence like DNA and craniometrics. And it says that tribal elders should be treated as expert witnesses, not to be questioned. This is an erosion of the importance of science in favor of an ideology. And that ideology is that identity, social identity, i.e. being Native American, is more important than the truth. That who's telling the story is basically given more weight than how true that story is, which can only be determined by research and science.
Let me pause you on the oral myths part of this. I'm a social anthropologist, and I would say in my field, we view myths as a very unstable resource. They change generation by generation. This week's elder may just be making up a story. So if we're going to approach myths as a substitute for science, on what authority do these people who claim to speak for a so-called tribe get the opportunity to do that? Can't someone just set up shop and say, those bones are my ancestors, leave them alone?
Well, I think that is, that's basically what's been happening. I've worked with some other individuals who are linguists, such as Glenn Custard, who also has documented very well that oral myths change all the time, and yet they're being treated like static. This is just not true, right? That they don't change. I mean, we know that stories change in even a decade or so. The law allows oral tradition and oral myth to be taken as evidence, and it kind of looks the other way when that oral tradition is complicated or conflicted with what it would be ancient, such as including stories about Jesus Christ and creation myths of Native Americans. And basically says, oh, we'll just pick and choose what part of the oral tradition we're going to use to make the claim, to believe the claim.
I want to ask you a bit about your professional background. You got your PhD in archaeology at the University of Arkansas in 2001, which means that you must have been in graduate school while the Kennewick Man saga was unfolding. I would have thought that would have been a pretty disturbing event in the life of a young archaeologist. How did you take it?
Absolutely. It was actually one of the things that really set me off with repatriation debate. One of my first articles was Kennewick Man's funeral. My PhD at the University of Arkansas was in the new program was environmental dynamics, and it was anthropology and archaeology and the geosciences. And one of the reasons why I chose the University of Arkansas was because there was a good anthropology and archaeology base there, so that I thought this was a very integrative approach. And interestingly, Jerry Rose, who was one of my professors and on my PhD dissertation, if I'm not incorrect, he was on the committee that was the government selected committee to study Kennewick Man. And he said, he knew the research that I had done for my master's and was planning to do for my PhD. So I got to do a study on Kennewick Man's cross sections of the femur and the tibia. So literally the CT scans of Kennewick Man's bones. And it was very hard to get that published, in part because it was kind of, nobody was publishing anything on Kennewick Man that was actually like data. But the other thing is, the stories I heard from Jerry Rose, about what was happening to Kennewick Man's skeleton during this time were disturbing. For example, at one point, and I don't know if this was ever resolved, there were so many people who were being able to go into the collections that weren't scientists, natives, and other groups that claimed religious, that Kennewick Man was important to them, religious, like neo-pagans. And that one of the bones got switched with another skeleton. And they knew this because all of a sudden there were 2 left thigh bones or something. I mean, this is like, and yet scientists were not allowed in, so it was, Kennewick Man was really kind of like a wake-up call that NAGPRA was going in the wrong direction. I'm not sure it ever went in the right direction, but at least it was like started off with a compromise, but that it was going in the wrong direction, that nothing was too old. And, I think about it this way: if we were in Africa and we had 3.6 million year old skeletal remains, I'm sure that there would be some modern tribal member who would be wanting to rebury Lucy, right? So that nothing was off limits. And that the story was, we've always been here because our religious creation myths told us so. And those people were being treated seriously while scientists were being locked out of the room. And it just really, it was very disturbing. Other acts like the burying of the site by the government so that no more excavation could be done was, troubling as well, of course.
For the handful of people on this call who don't know the Kennewick Man story, can you give us the Cliff Notes version of what it was?
So Kennewick Man was discovered, I believe, in '96, if I'm not wrong, eroding out of a riverbank in Washington State, Kennewick, Washington. And he was initially examined by Jim Chatters, who is a anthropologist, physical anthropologist, also with expertise in forensic anthropology. And he was called in as the forensic anthropologist to examine these remains. And initially, they thought that the remains were modern, like a murder victim, right? Turned out that when they were doing the examination, they noticed a little glint in his hip, which turned out to be an obsidian flake embedded in his hip bone, which then started off the thing of, wait, actually, this is not modern, right? And they did some x-rays, and then they started testing the antiquity of the remains, and it turned out about 8,000 years old, which is one of the older of the Paleo-Indians. On top of that, Kennewick Man's skull didn't quite look like what was expected of a Native American or indigenous skull. And so there was questions about where he came from. And instead of this being allowed to unfold naturally in research being conducted, there was an immediate attempt to basically bury the remains as Native American under NAGPRA. A team of scientists filed suit against the government in order to prevent that reburial. And that actually, some people are like, oh, it was, this was antagonistic and bad. But actually, because of that, it dragged the whole thing out. And eventually, it allowed for Kennewick Man to be the most well-studied Paleo-Indian that we have. Unfortunately, with DNA research, when the DNA research was completed, they came to the conclusion that he was Native American. He was, there was genetic similarity between him and one of the tribes that were claiming him, but also with all sorts of other people. And his DNA actually is more similar to South American Native indigenous peoples than North American. And yet this was enough, the link was enough to basically rebury Kennewick Man and end of story. Whereas it should have been the opening of a new page of, oh, well, this is interesting DNA. Let's see replications. Let's see how he compares with others, and let's continue on.
Back to Bruce. You were well along in your career when this event transpired. Did it affect you in any way?
I saw it coming for decades.
How so?
My own institution actually started with course evaluations, which were, students have a right to give their opinion. And the course evaluations became important in promotional, professional promotion. And by that time, the hiring process had gotten to the point where there was an imbalance in political views of the faculty, which didn't exist when I started there. And then in the 80s, there was an injection of what they called themselves post-structuralists, actually postmodernists, Tilly Shanks, Ian Hodder. I guess most of them wound up in California. And they began to argue that empirical, it's not called scientific, it's empirical, I'm a vulgar empiricist because I'm a scientist, but I just like to look at things and make my evaluation. They said, no, don't do that. We should be after reconstructing meaning. I frankly cannot imagine a more squishy term than trying to reconstruct meaning. Well, that started that inoculated our profession with a non-empiricist bias. And then I could just, one thing after another. And these folks managed to managed to train a whole generation. We're following them into the academy and are, at the moment, thinking that they are ascendant. Quite sure they're not, but they're full of themselves right now. But I saw it coming a long time ago.
When NAGPRA was proposed as legislation, did you oppose it then? Did you just?
No, they snookered me. I did not know an archaeologist, honestly, who opposed NAGPRA. We thought, okay, fair is fair. I advocated for my museum to relinquish, maybe 50 or 100 sets of human remains. I said, well, we could maybe vouch for the tribes existing for 500 years. I now know that's just not true, because I hadn't really done much ethnohistory at that point. Maybe 100, 150 years is more like it. But we said, well, we'll spot them an extra 500 years. So anything 1,000 years or less old, we're happy to return to the tribes whose traditional territory, which we now know is also an invalid concept, these remains were found in. And of course, what actually happened is when the tribes got them, they swapped them all among themselves. Some Penobscot region remains are now buried in a beach near Eastport, where they will certainly reemerge in the near future. It just went crazy. And at that point, we began to realize that from the get-go, the cards were stacked against empiricism and for this sort of mob of irrational people who range from mendacious to stupid.
Can you think of a particular point where you began to shift from this is a good thing to do to this isn't working as I thought it would?
Well, it was Kennewick Man, actually.
Well,
And particularly when one of the geneticists stacked the deck so that that local tribe would be the only one whose genes could be compared to Kennewick Man, and therefore the only tribe that could possibly claim any relationship to it. And the shame of it is some of these folks are mendacious, and some of them are, you know, to use a strong term, useful idiots. And the younger ones, they're damaging their career. They're ruining their career. If they have any hope of ever attaining scientific credibility again, they can kiss that goodbye, because they're lying. They're telling untruths. And once you have a reputation for behaving in that manner in the sciences, you're finished.
We're calling this webinar the repatriation debate. I should probably divulge to the listeners that, of course, to have a debate, one expects to have people on the other side. We don't. We also had a great deal of difficulty persuading people who are skeptical about the current standards in archaeology coming forward, being willing to speak up, because they openly expressed fear of the damage to their careers were they to do so. So here we are with two of you, but I don't want to speak for a field that's not my own. Elizabeth, where is everybody?
I think that there's a lot of disagreement. I don't think everybody is on board with repatriation as it's being conducted, as much as it seems. I do think that people are very frightened of losing their jobs, and that is one of the big problems. I reached out to many people trying to get people to talk, and like some people literally told me, you know, I would love to, but I'm so scared of losing my job. I think the people who are for repatriation, you know, oftentimes they don't want to engage in the debate. So that's another aspect of it. When I teach this topic in class, you know, one of the things is that I always assign, you know, a pro-repatriation or at least a neutral perspective as well, because I think it's important to see both sides of the topic. But so many times you cannot get both people to the same table, right? And in this case, it's hard to even get one side to the table. So I think people are scared.
Okay. I don't know about Bruce, but you've been the recipient of some pretty harsh language against you in this. How do you take that? Are you just shrugging it off as the price to be?
I think I have very thick skin. I don't know why, but I do. I think that, you know, I have no problem if people disagree with me, who have a different perspective on this. I do research and have done research with some people who completely disagree with my perspective on repatriation, and I respect their perspective, and you know, and so it's not really about whether somebody agrees with us or not, but rather whether a civil discussion can be held. And I've noticed with my own experience, for example, at the Society for American Archaeology, where they basically deplatformed my talk, that the arguments against me were not based on any kind of, they were not based on theory or intellect, but rather name calling. And so, you know, of course, you know, there's always the people who will say, you know, it's racist. Then there's people, you know, colonialists. Some people get even nastier and call me a bitch, you know. And also I can say is if that's your argument, then that you don't have an argument. I just don't think that it's even to be taken seriously. If that's their argument, I don't think that that's to be taken seriously.
Can I just add something?
Please.
All these counter arguments, air quotes, are not arguments. They cannot, I have not seen one single case made for why you'd be called a racist. Just racist. I say it's racist, so it's racist. The one argument was offered by a person named Bolden from the University of Connecticut, who gave a case of a possible misuse of genetic data taken from modern people. And this was supposed to be a case to justify the decolonization of archaeology and of all institutions to do with archaeology. That's mark that word. That's the one we've got to deal with now. Again, undefined. We want to decolonize the universities. I can't imagine a less colonized institution in the world than a university. So there's zero content to these claims. So
zero content, but a lot of power behind them, since they can ruin careers and prevent people.
It's the hysterical power of a mob.
I think, again, we should pause on a word for the audience here that may be less familiar with the jargon of the contemporary academy. Decolonization, what is that? I mean, you just said it's undefined, but let's give it a try.
It's empty intellectually. It's the assertion, the associated concept is settler colonialism. We know that all Europeans who came to this continent came to oppress Indians and steal their land. And therefore, we modern people who descend from European colonists are guilty of that original sin. And therefore, it's very closely akin to critical race theory. You're a colonist and don't know it. Therefore, all our institutions are benefited, based upon, derived from settler colonialism, and therefore they're bad, and they have to be decolonized. What that means varies by institution, but it basically means taken over by Marxists, I guess.
Okay.
I'd like to add, I'd like to add, I think that it's about power, and decolonization is in part about taking the power that the scientists have and putting it into the hands of the non-scientists or the indigenous. I think that in the case of NAGPRA, you see this like with the archaeologists having to be monitored, as like there's something that they have to be watched over in case they do something inappropriate. Or the other thing is that they have to get permission of what study they can do and what questions they can ask. So I do think it's very much about the shift of power.
Well,
that's what poststructuralism is all about, right? You perceive the world as a struggle for power. There's no other dimension that matters in human relations. Power is everything.
Okay. I don't know anything about the ethnic background of either of you, but I'm going to assume for the sake of this conversation that you would be classified as whites and as therefore beneficiaries of so-called settler colonialism, because some of your ancestors must have been settlers. So to be decolonized means essentially to be dethroned. All the privileges you've gained by growing up in Western civilization, all the benefits that you've had by being able to go to graduate school and have careers are illegitimate at some level. And to be decolonized is to be to renounce all those benefits that you've had and to listen to the people who have a superior moral claim to the things that we're talking about, that moral claim being based on a different line of ancestry, the colonized rather than the colonizers. That's the rhetoric that saturates the social sciences, not just archaeology, but anthropology and other fields. And here we are. Now, I'm going down this direction because it's where I can connect more directly with the two of you. I published a book a couple of years ago titled 1620, A Critical Response to the 1619 Project, which is the New York Times's effort to reinvent American history, starting with the arrival of slaves in Jamestown, Virginia in August of 1619. Now, historically, there's problems with that. English pirate ship did bring slaves to Jamestown at that time, but slavery was not a recognized institution in Virginia. They were turned into indentured servants. But out of this assertion, this bit of postmodern invention on the part of Nicole Hannah-Jones, the author of the original essay, has come the claim that basically slavery was an invention of the English settlers in North America. Now, anybody who knows any Western history knows that's not true, but the piece of it that strikes me as particularly upsetting to this drama is that slavery was already an indigenous institution among many peoples in native North America. And Elizabeth, you've recently written about this in a interesting essay titled Slavery, It's All Bad. Please explain.
Basically, we have this view that slavery is just about the slave trade in the U.S. Or in North America, and that it's our sin, right? When you look back at prehistory and history, we see that slavery was actually a global phenomenon. The ancient Egyptians had slaves, which they called speaking tools. In the Native American population, there were slaves before the colonialists come, and there were colonialists who came and thought that that Native Americans had all these wives, and really they were slaves. There was huge slave trade in the Middle East, of course, in Arabia. And I think the reason why I wrote that Slavery, It's All Bad was threefold. One is that there was a couple of stories about the Native American slave trade and how currently there are multiple tribes who are trying to kick out former slaves, the descendants of former slaves, right? So these people were, their ancestors were enslaved by the Native Americans, were then freed, and were told that they would always have a spot in the tribe. And now the tribes are like, wait, these people are not part of our tribe. They were, trying to kick them out. And I think that a lot of that, trying to call the tribe, making it smaller, is probably about profit, because they're, dividing up things like casino money and so forth. But it just made me look into the story much more, into the history of slavery. And I think that by not telling the whole story about slavery, about how it was in North America, how it was in Arabia and Africa, and so forth, what you lose is the remarkable progress that we had, this horrible way of life in almost every corner of the earth, and we've gotten rid of it. I mean, this is a good story, right? That slavery is almost unheard of now, not completely gone. And I do cover a couple modern cases in an essay, but I think that when we paint one population as those who are bad, we forget how much progress many populations have made. And it's just a misrepresentation of our past and of how far we've come. And then when I say we, I mean all people. And that's just sad. It's a sad way of learning, of thinking about history and about human evolution and about human society and civilization.
There's a certain desire to minimize or interpret out of existence the slavery practiced by Native American peoples. Sometimes it's presented as, well, they were slaves in some sense, but they were actually just adopted into the tribe and they were welcome. You point out that much of this slavery was what we call chattel slavery. They expected labor from these people, they bought them, they sold them, they were treated as having, I guess, what we would call a inferior set of rights, or they were presented as simply there to be used. And that's true of what we know historically for the Iroquois, but it appears not to be just some segment of the Native American population, but wherever we look, we find it.
Right.
Now, there is the problem, of course, that archaeology isn't always able to make those sorts of distinctions if we're going to start looking at sorry, my trash is being picked up. We might think, for example, that hunters and gatherers are not people who have much need for slaves, so that an agricultural society perhaps, but and yet the Northwest Coast Indians, people out in Vancouver Island and the like, were notorious for being a slave-based society. Any clues at all as to your 4,000-year-old red paint people in Maine? Might they be interpreted as having this institution? Any clue?
Well, my guess would be no, but it's only a guess, because they're seafarers, and seafaring societies generally, slavery doesn't work in seafaring societies. When you're at sea, being at sea, it requires a kind of social organization that requires a lot of mutual trust among people who are operating watercraft and hunting. And slavery just doesn't, I don't know many cases of slaves in a maritime hunting culture. I think chattel slavery is most useful in a terrestrial context.
Poses a challenge. I'm going to go looking. Thank you.
Please do. It's just an educated guess.
Right. This world of interpreting things out of existence seems to be at the heart of this debate. After all, that repatriation has now become the excuse for just making stuff up. And it doesn't seem to me that comports very well with the continued existence of archaeology. Now, both of you have said at least somewhat pessimistic things about the state of the discipline. Do you think archaeology will be here with us in a recognizable sense in another 20 years? Elizabeth first.
20 years, I'm not sure. I do think that things are cyclical. I do hope that things turn around and that people realize the importance of understanding the past in order to understand the present, and in order to see, how much progress has occurred. I think that eventually what will happen is that students will no longer be interested in a field of study where we're not really learning truths, or at least our best attempt at truth. I know that some people don't like to use the word truth, but I think that we do try to tell the most accurate story. And I think that when skeletal remains and artifacts are removed from shelves and all what you are left with is words and pictures, I think people are going to also find that it's not as an exciting of a field. There's a heavy attempt to get rid of pictures now. I mean, that was one of the reasons why things blew up at San Jose State as well, was because I had a photograph of me with a skull, a photograph that the university administrators would have been more than happy to take just a year or two earlier, and would have had no problem showcasing on the website, and instead it becomes this big taboo. I also think that part of this is about religion, it's tricky because in some ways, some of it is about sovereignty, of course, some of it is about postmodernism, but I think there is a kind of a rebirth of religion, and some people have suggested that this kind of woke mentality, political correctness, is in itself a religion. And what's the problem with religion, of course, is that people get more and more fervent about it sometimes. But what I think is going to happen, and this is my hope, so I could be completely wrong, is that things will get so bad that they have to turn around. Otherwise, nobody's going to be taking our classes, and that then new discoveries will be made, and hopefully those new skeletal remains that are uncovered or new artifacts won't be reburied as quickly. That's my hope.
That might require a change in the law.
Yes. I would hope so.
I disagree. The law was never intended, but we're speaking of NAGPRA. The law was never intended to be executed in this manner. In fact, there's an article I can recommend, and if we are exchanging our coordinates in this context, people can email me and I'll provide them with the articles that I'm referring to. One article refers to the fact that these institutions that are relinquishing artifacts probably breaking the law. And another article by a lawyer from Louisiana points out that the congressional intent of NAGPRA was badly violated by the rule that's under which it's being administered. Congress was very concerned that the ancient remains be carefully taken care of. That's their term, right? And that only recent remains to the level of grandparents, great-grandparents with direct genealogical information applied should be those returned under NAGPRA. So the activists who are well embedded in the Department of the Interior and other aspects of the federal government have managed to subvert the law about 180 degrees, I think.
Well, I think it's on that. Is there hope for the field of archaeology that they'll emerge from the shadow of these activists in the Department of the Interior and elsewhere?
I think we need to get things into court. We had great success with Kennewick Man because we got it into court. The court is the way to get around the mob that is influencing all these people who are scared of their shadows because they think they're going to lose their job by being called a colonialist or a scientist.
And how do you do that? What's the path to a court? Don't you need a plaintiff with a case?
I'm working on that right now, but I can't go into details.
Okay, well, I think that's a good mystery to keep going. In my field, anthropology, I'm more of an ethnographer than anything else. And I have, well, at least my wife considers an enormous library of ethnography, about 8,000 volumes. And I've spent a lifetime reading ethnography. And now I feel really sad in that these books now languish for lack of anybody to have any interest in them. The post-colonial mentality says that they were written by old white guys who benefited from the colonial regime. So any anthropology written before indigenous people started writing it themselves is invalid and not worth any attention at all. Well, it doesn't take much to break an academic discipline, actually. If you cease teaching its core texts, at least in an area like ethnography or anthropology, within a generation, nobody knows that stuff. And it may be the thirst for knowledge is still there, but people are going to be starting from a year zero approach. Maybe that's not the case in archaeology because it's some more empirical discipline. People will be able to pick up the shattered pieces and start again. But I wonder just how much is going to be left for people to discover if we've denuded the shelves of the museums. We have prohibited realistic field investigation, and we have stopped publication for a generation or so. So cheer me up, Elizabeth.
Oh no. I think that, you know, when I teach osteology or bioarchaeology, I think that students most want, I think they most want a hands-on experience. They want to be able to see, feel, and, you know, experience what skeletal remains are like, what artifacts are like, and learn from that kind of really hands-on experience. And I hope that as this hands-on experience gets taken away from them, that there will be an uprising of, you know what, this is not why I went into archaeology or why I went into osteology. I want to be able to examine skeletal remains. I don't want to just be told, you know, these remains are going to be back in the ground because, you know, our creation myths tell us that they should be. So I do hope that there's another generation, and even if, you know, it takes kind of a, you know, a step back, and basically, you know, they don't have a great foundation at the beginning. I do hope that just the love of anatomy, the love of the past overcomes that. I mean, one of the reasons why I'm an anthropologist, archaeologist, is because I love anatomy. And I just love the beauty of a skeleton and what it can all tell. And you don't get that without the actual skeleton, right? And I just can't believe that there aren't people, young people who aren't going to be satisfied with just looking on a piece of paper or a screen, and who want to get in there and say, yes, I want to be in the field. I want to have the skeletal remains, and I want to study them and know about them in depth, not just, you know, was it male, female, how old, and there it goes back in the ground, but really get to know these individuals on a real deep level. And I think that that's a strong, it's a strong draw for archaeologists. And I'm hoping that that's eventually will come back, that they'll be able to do that, and eventually those students who experience that will say, you know what, this is why I'm here.
So Elizabeth says that thirst for reality is what's going to right the ship. And Bruce says it's confrontation with some courts which decide that the misinterpretation of the law has to end. Bruce, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I will point out that there's a tremendous, how to put it, it's a tremendous interest among amateur people in archaeology and osteology. And these are prominent people, intelligent people, professional people who will not be cowed. And I think that you're going to very soon now see some pushback from these people. And the reason I mentioned court action is because we don't want the courts to decide that this is not proper. We want them to decide that it's illegal in many cases. And I think that we're going to get some help from professionals. This particular region doesn't have a lot of those people, but the Midwest is very strong, with and the Southeast, tremendous interest in prehistory. And I'm sure that this actually rather small mob of bullies, once confronted, like most small mobs, I think can be stopped. And a difference between the West and the East is the East is less complicit in government misbehavior regarding NAGPRA and prehistory. The more land the government owns, the worse the problem is, because the government is absolutely complicit in all these bad decisions. They encourage them, they cooperate with misinformation, they relinquish human rights to the wrong people for the wrong reasons. We have a lot of private property here in the Northeast in particular, and people can decide what to do with their own property. Now, there are forces out there who would overturn freehold rights of people to own what is on their property. Those will fail, at least in this region. That's one of the things I'm working on.
I just wanted to mention that Elizabeth's co-author, her most recent book was James Springer, who's an attorney with an archaeology background, Chicago, if I remember right. Is that his area?
Peoria.
Yeah. Okay, Illinois. So yes, there are fruitful connections with the law side of this. I think we're at the point where I am supposed to open this up to questions, and in the chat we've got a bunch of things. Let's see if any of them are actually questions. Some we've already answered. What exactly does decolonization mean? It doesn't exactly mean anything. These are questions that seldom have any question marks after them. Does reason have a chance here? A chance. NAGPRA is used to demand racial entitlement programs related to land use in Hawaii? Question mark. Anybody can deal with that?
I know that NAGPRA was, Hawaii was very much an important aspect of NAGPRA, and Native Hawaiians are actually mentioned separately throughout NAGPRA. One of the things about NAGPRA is that it dealt only with federally recognized tribes, and in order to be federally recognized, you need land. And so it's in places where the land is worth a huge amount, like Hawaii or like the Bay Area, tribes who weren't federally recognized were quite upset about this, right? So that basically that only federally recognized tribes could reclaim remains. And so I think that it works in both directions. Sometimes tribes wanted to get federal recognition so that they could repatriate their remains, and then that would help, and that would also be a land claim later. And sometimes tribes were not really that interested in the remains, but they wanted the land and wanted to make the argument that the links with collections make the state make the argument that they are linked to the land as well. So whichever one is more important, the land or the remains. And I think that this was very important in Hawaii and with tribes because of the small amount of land and the high value of the land. That answers a little bit of it.
Okay. I have a question for somebody whose archaeology is a little bit out of date. I'll let you correct him. My understanding was that arrival on this continent followed the glaciers. For South American Indians, it was about 7,000 years ago, and North American Indians, it was about 3,000 years ago. Is this correct? No, it's not. But go ahead.
Go ahead, Bruce.
Well, it's a lot earlier than that. You know, you have to be careful. You talk radiocarbon years versus calendar years. Let's talk calendar years, about 13,000. Now there's a very vigorous contingent of people who call themselves professional archaeologists who have persistently, ever since my first archaeological conference in 1965 at Denver, Colorado, at the Brown Palace Hotel. Then the site was Valsequillo. It was 17, 18,000 years ago. And ever since then, there's been site after site after site, and claim after claim after claim that Clovis, and these people say Clovis first is wrong. Well, it may be wrong, but the problem is in science, you look for patterns. What's this? I've never seen one before. You don't really know, but you get some ideas, then you find another one. Oh, now I'm beginning to think that I'm onto something here. But these early sites, in one case it's a scraper, the next time it's a wooden stake. And the time after that it's a footprint in the mud. It never coheres as any kind of a real challenge to about 13,000 years ago. But they got south a lot faster than that. They're probably down there 11, 12. Very rapid southward. And by the way, they never stop moving. This is why these claims we've been here forever are completely bogus.
I would add to that absolutely the glacier retreat and so did open certain passages, but earlier. But there were, I would suspect that there were multiple migrations over. There were probably migrations back too at some times, and that they kept on moving. But our earliest, I think our earliest evidence is, as Bruce said, about 12,000 years ago or so. Our earliest skeletal remains are around maybe 10,000. Lucia in South America was about 10,700 years. So those are our earliest skeletal remains.
We have an uninquisitive but fairly large audience. Let's see.
I think we just had a question pop up, but I don't have my glasses on because I'm a little vain, so I can't read any of them.
It's from Francis Woodison.
Oh, okay.
May not be a question though.
I'm not seeing it, but if you do, please go right ahead.
I see.
A lot of these are comments rather than questions.
Yeah.
So let's.
Can I just take a minute?
I think Francis Widowson's question is, why is the government complicit? And I think that's a good question. And I think Bruce could answer that.
I hate to use these terms. It sounds like the 1950s. They've been infiltrated by these activists. The Department of the Interior in particular. Once you get a few, well, let me start with my own educational experience. I got the first anthropology degree ever from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. I got a superb education, very skilled professors, mostly from the big East Coast schools. And then after I left, they hired the first Marxist, and the department has gone completely over. And in fact, it's one of the epicenters for this whole wave of silliness. And that's happened in some departments of the federal government as well. So that's how government is complicit. It's not formal policy. In fact, it's counter-legal in many instances, but it's unsupervised. I've worked in a bureaucracy long enough to know that the real shenanigans are one level below what any chief executive ever bothers to look at. And that's certainly the case with NAGPRA and the Department of the Interior. So that's how complicity comes about.
I also think that the other aspect is the land and water rights, and where federal land is. That in some cases the government thought it's easier just to go ahead, give the collections back, to pass NAGPRA, to make it as as easy as possible, and so that we can have access to our to the land underneath, or the minerals, or the water. And on the flip side, of course, any institution that accepts federal funding starts to fall under NAGPRA, which and one of the tragedies might be that in the COVID time, a lot of private institutions who never took federal money have taken federal money during COVID, and now these small museums may have to start following NAGPRA guidelines, which might be quite disastrous for some.
Well, the ability of federal bureaucrats to spread their authority has become pretty clear to Americans. In the case of Kennewick Man, that was when Bill Clinton was president. He had the Army Corps of Engineers destroy the site where the bones were recovered from. So in that case, there was very much a political decision made that, for whatever reasons, that this was going to be in his interest to do it. I don't know that this has ever been a partisan matter between Democrats and Republicans. It does, however, seem to be something that local politicians can play with as well. That is seeking favor with particular constituencies. You've both won glowing endorsements from a variety of people, but I'll skip those. Any comment on the existence of Mongolian spots confirms the genetic connections with Asiatic indigenous groups? Question mark. Neither of you deal with that particular part of the anatomy.
I think that there are some Mongolian remains that might be more Western. There's definitely been mummies that do not look East Asian that are found in Mongolia, that the Chinese government has tried to rebury and hide. So I think that the human story is movement and mating, and that there's probably all sorts of links that we don't know of yet.
Okay. Unless more questions come in, I think that we're back into conversation with each other. So maybe this is a point where I can have the two of you question one another. Bruce, how do you happen to know Elizabeth?
I published an article in Colette about these people and the attempts of woke scientists to stem the inevitable tide of the power of paleogenetics to resolve deep human history. It's just an incredible. This negative reaction, I think, is a sign of their tremendous fear of the power of this scientific technique to reveal real history. It's so inconvenient for their political preferences and their philosophical preferences. The truth is malleable, the truth is relative, there is no truth. And so I think that is part of the vehemence of the opposition. But I think it's inevitably this technology is going to exist. It's going to win. There's no way, as I say, it may have to go to court a few times, but only a few times. And then I think the power of the mob would be broken, and we'll be able to get on with it.
I had read that Quillette article, and Jim Springer and I were working on an article for Quillette too, and we were told, incorporate Bruce's, to cross-reference it, and so I had actually, right before I was told that, I had already read it, and I was like, oh, I wonder how this can work in. And so we really met on the basis of that kind of similar work on an art. Quillette, for those people who don't know, is a more like a popular website of news stories and science. It leans, I would say, libertarian a little bit. It's very focused on free thought and free inquiry, I would say. And they are willing to publish things that are controversial. And so I think that that's, reading Bruce's and writing Quillette is how we met. And then we just realized how much, in some ways, our views on the repatriation issue and on the science in general overlap. I might say I read Bruce's book that he so kindly sent to me, and it is a beautiful book. The artifacts, the pictures that are in the book, it's just a beautiful book. And I really enjoyed reading it, and so we just continued on our conversation, so to speak.
And Elizabeth sent me her book, and she also sent me the list of people who didn't want it to be published. It was interesting to read. I know some of the people on that list. I have no respect for any of the ones I know. But yeah, so we've been exchanging books and exchanging ideas and planning things for the future as well. And let me just show you a cover of my book. I don't make a dime on this book. Okay. So I'm not plugging it for any financial benefit, but this is at the Swordfish Hunters, and it's available on Amazon.
Great.
And from me directly if you ask for one.
Well, and it's a book that you can read and understand even if you have no background in archaeology. And I think I just think it was so beautiful. It's just those artifacts were so just stunning, I would say. And so I really enjoyed it from that aesthetic point of view as well.
Well, you've made one sale. I will follow up and see what Amazon can do. I see a couple more points here that are worth bringing up. Are universities' land acknowledgement statements consolidating the orthodoxy of repatriation groups? And here I should say that I'm speaking to you from Madison Avenue, which was prehistorically, I guess, Lenape land from the Isle of Manhattan. And therefore, this is brought to you by the spirits of the ancestors, something like that.
Land acknowledgements, yeah. I think that this is a way to bring the repatriation ideology to everybody in the university, not just those in archaeology. I find them very troublesome. I think that it tells a false narrative of land ownership that wasn't really in existence. I think that the other problem is that they're basically, it's many of them are basically prayers or, kind of like a religious statement or a statement that, that you're going to agree with this concept of postmodernism and a false narrative of, these peaceful Indians had this land before, and then we came and we stole it from them, as opposed to the more interesting past of people were moving around, people were getting into fights, sometimes they would be merging, and it was a hodgepodge. So I find them dishonest, but I also find that it is a way to try to bring that ideology of, the indigenous story is a true story, and it is a good story, and the others who came later are the robbers. I think it's trying to bring that to a bigger audience and not just archaeology.
One contributor gives us this quotation. I'm not sure who it's from. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. If anybody recognizes that.
I do, and I've actually used it in my article. I should know it. Is it Orwell?
Could be. I don't know.
George Orwell, I see. Yeah. Yes, it's George Orwell. Great quote.
Oh, it's from 1984. All right.
Yeah.
No.
So Big Brother is controlling archaeology right now. Did people opposing the publication of this book, I assume that's your book, Elizabeth, articulate any reasons for their opposition? I believe they did, sort of.
Yeah, I think that they claimed that it was anti-Indigenous, which it's not. That it was racist, which it's not. And also that it was colonial and anti-science. I would say that it's never anti something to try to, tell the most accurate version of a story. I think as for the being for or against repatriation, that doesn't, I know Native Americans who are against repatriation. So I don't think that it's about being anti-Indigenous. I think that it's about being for science, for telling the past as accurately as possible, as opposed to letting a postmodernist ideology tell the story that's not even accurate. So, but those were the allegations that were thrown to us. Interestingly, the book itself it was peer reviewed, of course. Nobody ever brought up any of those problems. Now, it's not that the reviewers all loved the book immediately. There were issues about style and about blending Jim and my work and all sort of organization. So it wasn't like they were just like, oh yeah, sure, check. It wasn't like that. But what they didn't say was, oh, this is a racist, book, anti-Indigenous book. That was not the criticism until it was published, right? So I don't. Those are the main things, and I think it's kind of funny, or ironic, that the people who have argued that my book, Springer and my book, should not be on the bookshelves, should be banned. Then they kind of walked it back a little bit and they said, we're not really asking for complete banning. We just don't want it to be open access so people can't have it for free. And yet, in the same token, if you look it up on Twitter, they're constantly asking each other for a free copy, So it's fine for the people who are criticizing to want a free copy, but they don't want other people who might be persuaded by the arguments that Jim and I put forth to have a free copy.
Well, it's a fairly expensive book, so I understand why they want it free.
Yes. Okay.
Well, there's other comments here that don't really look like questions, although a few of them are phrased that way. Charlevoix's History of New France relays that the path of North American Indians was one of unremitting internecine warfare. Is that true?
True.
Yes, absolutely.
True.
I think part of the reason is because they didn't have, part of the reason is just human nature, right? But the other part of the reason, I think, is that they didn't have a written language. And therefore, they didn't have any way to say what belongs to who. And therefore, there was a lot of fighting constantly for things for land, for example. I think that is part of the big story. When resources got tight, when climate got bad, fighting increased. I've looked at skeletal remains from the Rhine Mountain, the Alameda collection that literally have obsidian flakes sticking out of the jaw or from the backbone. These were not accidental shootings. This was warfare. So I do think it's true, yes.
But I will say that in Charlevoix's case, the warfare was greatly intensified by the arrival of Europeans.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not conflict of natives running away from Europeans. This is conflict about natives gaining access to Europeans, because the economic interaction was immediate and intense and necessary for both parties.
In the very ancient remains that you've examined from Maine, is there evidence of violence, warfare there, or are these people generally pretty?
Bone preservation in our area is minimal. Okay. We do have cases of arrows found within body cavities. We have cases pretty clearly of cannibalism, but in terms of large samples from which to make these judgments, we just don't have them.
Let's see. Well, we are nearly out of time. I want to make sure that you each have a moment of summation here. Maybe start with Bruce. How would you wrap up this conversation on repatriation?
It's been a sad chapter, but part of a much larger sad chapter in American higher education. As I said, there are different kinds of people in the game for different reasons, and those who are sincere, have been misled, will have very unfortunate outcomes of their professional careers. Not that anyone's going to go after them, it's just that no one's going to believe a thing they say ever again, because they've fought the line. I think they're going to fail. I think they're going to fail fairly quickly. But I think the American institutions of higher education have got to wake up, not just to this problem, but to widespread problems, which are all spawned from the same root cause, the Title IX problems, the admissions criteria problems. These are all part of the same kind of miasma that affects 21st century higher education in the United States, North America. We haven't discussed Canada.
Oh,
things are
worse.
Yeah. But I think we're going to get through it. I have faith. We have probably too large an industry of higher education, too many universities, too many graduate departments. I think that's all out of balance. That's all usually driven by professors' egos and compliant administrators. But I'm a little bit more optimistic than Elizabeth, actually. Maybe.
The challenge of intellectual authority, Elizabeth? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I don't think of myself as very pessimistic. I do think that science will win out. I do think that the desire to understand the real truth will win out. To most accurately describe the past will win out. I just don't know when it's going to win out. I think that the repatriation debate, initially, there might have been good intentions, and you might have been concerned about keeping collections where there was truly a link with family members, like great-great-grandfathers or so. And that might have been a good intention at the beginning, but I think it's just gone to a place where it was never meant to be, especially with the Paleo Indians, but not just with the Paleo Indians. And if things go too much the wrong way, I think we're not only going to lose the skeletal remains and the artifacts, but I think we might also lose the books, the pictures, and the data. There's a movement now in indigenous archaeology to make it so that if somebody wants to look up data on digital databases, that they have to put in their demographics, i.e. whether they're a woman, a man, European or tribal, and depending on what their identity is will depend on what you're allowed to read. And this is just completely against science, the ideology of the search for objective knowledge. And I hope that the more things like this are made open and people can know about them, that there will be a pushback. And I'm hopeful that there will be.
Before I let you go, there's two questions here that you could give a quick answer to. Someone wants to know this name of the site that you work in Alameda County or worked in.
It is the Ryan Mound site. It was excavated starting in the last main excavations were like in the 60s. The collection was actually twice as the size that it is now. The excavations occurred with Stanford and San Jose State. Stanford decided to rebury their part of the collection pretty much right before the passing of NAGPRA, which turned out to be a big mistake because San Jose kept the collection, curated the collection, and it was available for study for decades, and was used not only by myself, but also by numerous graduate students and other anthropologists, archaeologists. It goes by also the name, so the Ryan Mound, but also it goes by the number CA for California, ALA and 329.
I think we've been cut off here, but thank you both very much for this lively conversation, and thank this appreciative audience as well. I hope we'll be able to answer some of these questions offline. Bruce, my pleasure meeting you.